Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we take the sources you've shared, the learner, and really try to get to the heart of the information.
Yeah, extract the key insights, make it digestible without, feeling overwhelming.
Exactly. And today, we're diving into something pretty fundamental, intellect and memory. We're looking at some really interesting material focusing on the neurological side of things.
Right, how our brains actually handle these higher cognitive functions.
Our mission, basically, is to unpack that relationship between your mind and your brain. How you think, how you learn, how you remember.
And how it's all organized in there and, well, what happens when things go wrong.
Okay, so to kick things off, let's think about this really powerful idea from Francis Crick, the DNA guy.
Mm-hmm.
He had this astonishing hypothesis. He basically said, your joys and your sorrows, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules.
Wow. That's quite a statement. It really sets the stage, doesn't it? Puts the physical brain front and center.
It really does. It forces us to think about the biological roots of, well, everything we experience mentally.
And Crick's idea really points us towards the brain, specifically the cerebral cortex, as the physical basis for our intellect, for all that complex human thought.
The cortex is like the main control room.
You could say that. The source describes it as this incredibly intricate communication system, the neural switchboard for conscious thought.
And intricate is putting it mildly, right? The sheer number of neurons, over 14 billion in the human cortex alone.
Yeah, and proportionally, it's huge compared to other animals. The scale is just, well, hard to wrap your head around.
So here's something I found interesting. Most of those neurons, something like 75% in the cortex, are in what's called the association cortex.
Right. And that's really key for understanding higher level thinking. Because while some initial sensory processing happens elsewhere, the association cortex is where the more sophisticated cognitive work gets done.
Okay, so how is the cortex organized overall? The source mentions primary sensory areas.
Exactly. You've got specific zones that are the first stop for sensory info. Vision in the back, the occipital lobe.
Right.
Hearing in the temporal lobes on the sides. Touch and spatial stuff in the parietal lobe, kind of top back.
Okay.
And probably areas for taste and smell, too, maybe overlapping a bit into the frontal and temporal lobes. These are the entry points.
Got it. So the raw data comes in there. Then what? It moves to the unimodal association cortex.
Precisely. Unimodal meaning it's still dealing with one type of sense, like vision or hearing, but it starts processing that raw data in more complex ways.
Refining it.
Yeah, building up a more unified perception, like recognizing lines and shapes before you recognize a whole object. The text mentions these vertical columns of cells called modules.
Modules, right, like little specialized teams.
Kind of like that, yeah. Working together within that sensory area.
Okay, and the visual system is a good example of this step-by-step process.
It's a really well-studied one, thanks to Hubel and Weissel's work.
Yeah.
They showed how info goes from the eye, through the optic nerve, to the thalamus, like a relay station, and then to the primary visual cortex.
Mm-hmm.
And there, neurons start simple, detecting basic stuff like edges or lines.
Just lines of light.
Yeah, or the orientation of a line or movement. Then that information feeds into more complex cells. It's like building blocks for perception.
Fascinating. So these unimodal areas dealing with one sense, they don't just work alone, do they? They connect up to something bigger.
Exactly. They feed into what's called the heteromodal association cortex. Hetero meaning different modes or different senses.
Okay, bringing different senses together.
Right. And the source highlights two main spots. First, there's the posterior area, back near the parietal lobe, including the angular gyrus.
And what's special about that?
Its job is making links between different senses, like understanding that the picture of a boat, the word boat, and the sound boat all refer to the same thing. That's a pretty uniquely human skill.
Connecting the dots across senses. The text compared it to computer networks.
Yeah, a helpful analogy. Different inputs converging to form a single unified concept, like boatness.
Makes sense. And the second heteromodal area, the lateral prefrontal region. Sounds important.
It definitely is. Think of it as the brain's executive suite. It's heavily involved in attention, what we call working memory.
Holding things in mind.
Right, actively manipulating information. And also crucial for sequences, planning actions, ordering thoughts. This is basically executive function.
The manager deciding what needs attention, what to do next.
Pretty much, yeah. The air traffic control for our thoughts and actions.
Okay. Now there's another frontal bit, mentioned the orbitofrontal cortex, or supramal cortex. This sounds like where feelings come in.
You got it. It's key for our emotional states, drives, appetites. And importantly, it integrates our internal bodily feelings with what's happening outside.
So, linking gut feelings with external events.
Sort of, yeah. It has strong ties to the limbic system, the emotional brain, and our autonomic functions, like heart rate. This fits with McLean's idea that consciousness needs this link between the emotional limbic system and the thinking neocortex.
Which leads us right into consciousness itself, a tricky topic.
Very tricky. The text acknowledges it's fundamentally subjective,
Right.
right? Your experience of being conscious is unique to you.
But neuroscience tries to study it objectively. Crick suggested using vision.
Yeah, visual awareness as a model. Because we understand the visual system relatively well, his idea was, look, the primary visual cortex processes tons of stuff, but those neurons probably don't directly create conscious awareness. We aren't aware of every single thing our eyes pick up.
There's a filter.
Seems like it. It's more like when an object activates neurons across several association areas, and those associations pop into our awareness or short-term memory, then we consciously perceive it.
And the frontal cortex is the gatekeeper.
That seems crucial, yes. Activation there appears necessary for a visual percept to become conscious. The text mentions blind sight, too.
Where people can react to things they don't consciously see.
Exactly. Suggests some processing happens without awareness. So conscious vision seems to be this dynamic dance between the visual areas and the prefrontal systems handling attention and working memory.
And don't forget the orbitofrontal cortex integrating the internal state.
Right, adding that layer of, how does this feel, or is this relevant to me? It all contributes.
It's incredibly interconnected. The text even mentions we perceive different aspects, like color versus object ID at slightly different speeds.
Yeah, and the thalamus might play a role in synchronizing all that for a smooth, conscious experience. And then there's the whole ventral versus dorsal stream thing in vision.
Okay, break that down.
Sure, the ventral stream going towards the temporal lobe is more about what an object is recognizing it. That's often conscious.
And the dorsal.
Towards the parietal lobe, more about where things are, guiding actions like reaching, often less conscious, more automatic.
That makes sense. And the clinical examples of unconscious processing are wild. Blindsight we mentioned.
Right, and extinguished perception. Patients with right hemisphere damage might not consciously see something on their left if there's also something on their right.
Even though their brain detects it.
Yeah, fMRI shows activity, but awareness is suppressed. It highlights how much happens beneath the surface.
Libet's finding, too, that half-second delay needed for conscious awareness.
And other studies, like monkeys processing colors they didn't report seeing, or just everyday things.
Like jumping back from a hot stove before you even feel the pain, or driving home on autopilot.
Exactly. Bruss called it the non-Freudian unconscious. Not repressed desires, just automatic brain processes handling things efficiently without bothering our conscious mind. Even language rules, matching words without thinking about meaning.
It's like there's a whole other operating system running in the background. The text also talks about the sense of self, linking it to the right frontal cortex.
Yeah, evidence comes from things like the WADA test, where numbing one hemisphere affects self-perception.
Temporarily shutting down half the brain.
Kind of, yeah. And also from patients with frontotemporal dementia, where damage to the right frontal lobe often leads to changes in personality and self-awareness.
Wow.
Even our ability to understand others' minds, theory of mind, seems tied to this right frontotemporal region. It suggests it's crucial for knowing me and understanding you.
So the right frontal lobe is key for our inner world and social understanding.
Mm-hmm.
And the frontal lobes overall, they had these networks for consciousness and behavior.
Cummings proposed 5 key networks, basically loops connecting the frontal lobe with deeper structures like the basal ganglia and thalamus. These circuits seem critical.
And studying brain damage gives us huge insights, right?
Absolutely. Clinical neurology is a window into this. Lesions in the brainstem or thalamus hitting the reticular activating system. That can cause coma.
Lots of arousal.
Exactly. Whereas diffuse damage across both hemispheres might lead to a vegetative state awake but unresponsive.
Or the minimally conscious state with some slight responsiveness.
Right, and then there's the whole controversial area of using brain imaging to detect potential awareness in some of those patients.
The tennis experiment. Asking them to imagine playing tennis or walking through their house.
Yeah, showing distinct brain activity patterns, suggesting they could follow commands, maybe even answer yes-no questions mentally. It raises huge ethical questions about diagnosis and care.
It's fully complex.
Yeah.
and less severe damage.
Can cause things like encephalopathy, delirium, dementia, and then focal lesions damage to specific spots cause specific problems, like Broca's aphasia affecting speech production or Wernicke's affecting comprehension.
Or Gerstmann syndrome, visual agnosia, apraxia, specific skills lost.
Precisely. It shows how different cortical areas contribute specialized functions.
And the frontal lobes integrate all this. Phineas Gage is the classic example, isn't he?
The textbook case. Severe frontal injury, massive personality change. He seemed impulsive, socially inappropriate, even though some basic cognitive tests might have seemed okay.
So the damage can be subtle on standard tests.
Sometimes, yes. Trouble with abstract thought, like interpreting proverbs, or difficulty with planning and sequences. Like the Luria sequential shapes test mentioned in the text, drawing alternating shapes. Frontal damage makes that hard.
It shows how personality and higher-level control are tied to that brain region. What about split brain patients?
Fascinating stuff. When the connection between the two hemispheres is cut, it's almost like you have two separate streams of consciousness.
Really?
Well, the left hemisphere, usually handling language, can talk about what it experiences. The right hemisphere might know things but can't verbalize it, demonstrating its knowledge non-verbally, kind of like blind sight.
And the alien hand syndrome.
A striking example. One hand seems to act on its own without the person's conscious will. It really highlights the potential for divided awareness when the hemispheres can't communicate properly.
Incredible. Okay, let's shift gears slightly, but stay with these core functions. Let's talk about memory.
Another huge topic. Defined simply as the brain's ability to store and retrieve information. Absolutely fundamental for learning.
And memories feel different, don't they? Like Proust's Madeleine, that vivid, sensory-rich recall.
Versus just knowing a fact like who the first president was. Very different qualities.
Clinically, the text divides memory based on time.
Yeah, into three main stages. First, immediate memory, which is basically the same as working memory.
That mental scratch pad.
Exactly. Holding information actively in your conscious awareness, manipulating it, like remembering a phone number just long enough to dial it.
And it's limited, right? Miller's magic number 7, ±2.
Around 5 to 9 meaningful items, yeah. And it fades fast without attention or rehearsal, gone in maybe 18-20 seconds.
And this relies heavily on the prefrontal cortex.
Primarily, yes. It declines with age and gets hit by attention problems, frontal damage, even aphasia.
Okay, so immediate working memory. What's next?
Short-term or recent memory, sometimes called episodic memory. This is about encoding and retrieving specific things, items, events after minutes or hours.
So remembering what you had for breakfast this morning.
That's a perfect example. This stage critically involves the hippocampus and nearby areas in the medial temporal lobe. They're essential for encoding, for filing away that new memory.
And the amygdala adds the emotional flavor.
Right, the emotional or social context. Retrieval then involves teamwork between the prefrontal cortex and these medial temporal regions.
The text had that great analogy. The frontal lobes are the filing clerk.
And the medial temporal lobes are the filing cabinet, with the white matter tracks being the way to access the files.
Makes sense. Damage the clerk, the cabinet, or the connection, and you've got problems recalling recent stuff.
Precisely. Bedside tests often check this, like asking you to recall 3 unrelated words after 5 minutes.
Okay. And the third stage, remote memory.
Remote or long-term episodic memory. Retrieving things from weeks, months, years ago. What's interesting here is that retrieval seems to become less dependent on the hippocampus over time.
The memory moves somewhere else.
Not exactly moves, but the storage becomes consolidated, more reliant on the neocortex. This happens at the synapse level, changes in connections, and at a systems level, strengthening cortical networks.
So the hippocampus is crucial for making the memory, but maybe not always for retrieving it later.
Especially for very old memories, yes. That's why patients like HM or those with early Alzheimer's might recall their childhood, but not yesterday. The frontal lobes are still needed for retrieval, though, to initiate the search in the cortex.
Got it. Now, within long-term memory, there's episodic, the personal events, and semantic memory.
Right. Semantic memory is your database of facts. Meanings, concepts, general world knowledge. Knowing Paris is the capital of France, or what a dog is.
Stuff you know, but maybe don't remember learning.
Exactly. It's constantly updated through reading, conversation, and it seems stored across multiple cortical areas depending on the type of knowledge. Visual facts in visual areas, word meanings maybe in the left temporal lobe.
And this kind of memory is tougher, More resistant to damage.
Remote semantic memory often holds up quite well, even with significant medial temporal damage.
Okay, so the brain's encyclopedia can survive even if the recent events diary is damaged. Let's dig into how those episodic memories actually get formed and retrieved. The networks involved sound complex.
They really are. Functional brain imaging, like fMRI and PET scans, has shown us a lot. Encoding a new memory lights up a whole network.
Including the hippocampus.
Oh, yeah, the hippocampus and its subregions are central, but also the amygdala, nearby cortices like entorhinal and perinal, the temporal pole, insula, parts of the prefrontal cortex, cingulate cortex, parietal cortex. It's a big team effort.
So how does it work? Information comes in.
Through sensory cortices. The prefrontal regions focus attention, select what's important, then it funnels through the entorhinal cortex into the hippocampus.
And the hippocampus does what?
A key part, the dentate gyrus, acts like a pattern separator, making sure each new memory has a unique neural fingerprint. Then another part, CA3, seems to temporarily store these unique patterns or associations.
Wow, okay. Creating a unique tag for each memory. And retrieval, pulling that memory back out.
Also involves a widespread network. Consistently active areas include the prefrontal cortex, especially the right side.
Why the right side specifically?
Good question. It seems particularly involved in the effort of retrieval, monitoring the process. Also active are the hippocampus medial temporal regions again, the cingulate cortex, posterior midline areas involved in imagery, the parietal cortex for spatial awareness, and even the cerebellum.
Different parts doing different jobs during retrieval.
Seems that way. Prefrontal for attention and search, hippocampus for conscious recollection, cingulate for selecting the right response, posterior areas for mental imagery.
It's like an orchestra playing the memory back.
A good analogy. And there are subtle differences in brain activity depending on whether you're just recognizing something familiar versus actively recalling details.
Interesting. And deeper processing leads to better memory.
Absolutely. Studies show that thinking about the meaning of information activates areas like the left prefrontal cortex more and leads to stronger memory traces than just, say, focusing on the appearance of words.
Makes intuitive sense. Pay attention to meaning, remember it better.
Right. And the amygdala fires up strongly when retrieving emotional memories, especially fearful ones.
And what about the basic nuts and bolts? The biochemistry.
Research on simple organisms like sea slugs, aplysia, or fruit flies has been huge here. Kandel won a Nobel Prize for work showing specific genes like CREB and protein synthesis are needed to strengthen synaptic connections for long-term memory, long-term potentiation.
Making new proteins to store memories.
Essentially, yes. Blocking protein synthesis in the hippocampus can prevent memories from consolidating. It's likely similar molecular processes happen in humans, transitioning from working memory to long-term storage.
Which raises the possibility of memory-enhancing drugs?
It's an active area of research, definitely, targeting those molecular pathways.
Fascinating potential. Okay, let's talk about when memory systems break down amnestic syndrome.
Right. This is characterized by a really profound loss of recent, short-term episodic memory. You can't form new memories effectively, and you've lost memories for a period before the damage.
But other things are okay.
Crucially, yes. Immediate or working memory is usually normal. You can hold a conversation. Remote memory, especially semantic knowledge, is often largely intact. And other cognitive functions like language, attention, general intelligence are typically preserved. That's what distinguishes it from dementia.
And procedural memory skills.
Also usually spared. The classic example is patient HM, who could learn mirror drawing but never remembered doing it before. Shows different memory systems.
Right. So it's a specific hit to that recent episodic memory system. And head trauma can cause it by disrupting consolidation.
Yes. The process of stabilizing new memories is vulnerable, and we know the hippocampus is vital for initially learning and recalling new info, but long-term storage shifts more to the neocortex over time.
So damage to the hippocampus causes both anterograde amnesia, can't make new memories, and some retrograde amnesia, losing past ones.
Exactly. Often the retrograde amnesia affects recent memories more severely than very old ones, that shrinking pattern.
And the damage has to be on both sides.
For severe global amnesia, yes. Bilateral damage to the hippocampus, perihippocampal gyrus, and entorhinal cortex is the classic finding, seen in HM and animal models.
What causes such damage?
Besides surgery like HN strokes in the posterior cerebral arteries supplying those areas, or certain infections like herpes simplex encephalitis, which unfortunately likes those medial temporal and orbitofrontal regions.
But it's not just the hippocampus. Other areas are involved.
Absolutely. Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome from thiamine deficiency, often seen in chronic alcoholism, damages the mammillary bodies and parts of the thalamus, causing severe amnesia. Strokes in the thalamus can do it too.
And the Pepez circuit connects these.
Yes, that loop hippocampus, fornix, mammillary bodies, thalamus, cingulate gyrus is critical. Damage anywhere along that circuit can disrupt memory registration and retrieval. Aneurysms affecting arteries near the septal nuclei can also cause amnesia, often with confabulation making up stories and frontal lobe dysfunction.
So several interconnected structures are vulnerable. The text summarizes the key features nicely. In box 7.1, impaired recent memory, spared procedural, preserved immediate and remote, intact cognition otherwise.
And figure 7.2 shows that network visually, the medial temporal lobes, thalamus, prefrontal cortex, cingulate, all working together.
Okay, so that's global amnesia. What about partial memory loss?
That happens too. Damage might be more localized or affect only one side, like left temporal damage might hit verbal memory harder.
Remembering words or stories.
Right. While right temporal damage might impact nonverbal memory, more like remembering faces or routes.
And even sensory-specific memory loss.
Rarer, but yes. Pure visual memory loss, for instance. The text mentions patients who couldn't learn new spatial layouts visually, even if they could describe their own home from past memory.
Wow. Okay, then there's transient amnesia, temporary loss.
Yeah.
TGA sounds dramatic.
Transient global amnesia. It is. Suddenly, someone, usually middle-aged or older, loses recent memory completely. They seem fine otherwise, but are confused, keep asking the same questions.
How long does it last?
Usually hours, maybe up to 24. They have both anterograde and retrograde amnesia during the attack. Afterwards, the retrograde shrinks, but they're left with a permanent gap in their memory for the episode itself.
What causes it?
It's not fully clear. Theories include transient ischemia, temporary lack of blood flow to the hippocampus, maybe related to migraine, or even a type of seizure.
And imaging shows something.
Sometimes. Diffusion MRI during or shortly after TGA can show small, temporary abnormalities, often in the CA1 region of the left hippocampus. Suggests temporary dysfunction, not necessarily permanent damage.
So temporary glitch in the memory system. Are there other causes of temporary amnesia?
Sure. Confusional states during migraines, certain types of epilepsy, drug intoxication, alcoholic blackouts, even minor head injuries can cause transient memory problems.
Right. Now, we've focused heavily on declarative memory stuff we consciously recall. What about the other kind? Non-declarative or implicit?
This is memory expressed through performance without conscious awareness. Skills, habits, conditioning.
Like riding a bike.
The classic example. You know how to do it, but you don't consciously retrieve the steps each time. This type of memory depends more on areas like the basal ganglia and cerebellum, and it's often spared in amnesia.
So knowing how versus knowing that.
Yeah. Exactly. Amnesic patients can learn new motor skills, remember? That involves the basal ganglia, cerebellum, supplementary motor cortex. Even classical conditioning, like Pavlov's dogs, relies on the cerebellum and can happen without hippocampal involvement.
What other types are there?
The source mentions probabilistic classification learning patterns implicitly, impaired by basal ganglia disease, learning artificial grammar rules without being aware of the rules.
And priming.
Yeah, where exposure to something makes you process it faster or better later, even if you don't consciously remember the first exposure. Like if I say nurse, you might recognize doctor faster afterwards.
And this can help amnesic patients.
It seems so. Priming relies on the neocortex and can provide a kind of unconscious memory support, helping them compensate in some tasks.
Fascinating how the brain finds workarounds. Okay, shifting to the practical side, how do you actually test all this at the bedside?
It's a core part of the neurological exam. You really have to assess mental status systematically, even if someone seems alert and oriented.
Easy to miss subtle problems.
Very easy. People can cover well, especially with good social skills, or rely on family members, so you need to probe.
What do you look for?
A range of things. Orientation time, place, situation, memory, immediate recall, like digit span, short-term, like recalling words after a delay, remote, like naming presidents, fund of information, speech and language fluency, naming, comprehension, repetition, reading, writing.
Praxis too. performing actions.
Yes, pretending to use objects, copying gestures, calculations, visual spatial skills, copying shapes like cubes or intersecting pentagons, drawing a clock.
The clock drawing test, that can show neglect, right?
Absolutely. Like in figure 7.3, where the patient with right parietal damage squishes all the numbers onto one side. Also, insight, judgment, abstract reasoning like proverbs or similarities, and sequential tasks like Luria's alternating shapes.
And different tests point to different brain areas.
Generally, yes. Language points to left hemisphere, calculations and praxis, often left parietal, visual constructional, usually right parietal. Executive functions like insight and sequencing point to frontal lobes.
Are there standard bedside tests?
Several common ones. The MMSC Mini Mental State Exam is probably the best known. Also, the MoCA Montreal Cognitive Assessment, SLUMS Mini Cog.
What does the MMSE involve?
It covers orientation, repeating words, attention, like spelling world backwards, recalling those words later, naming objects, following commands, writing a sentence, copying a design. Takes about 10 minutes.
Quick, but has downsides.
Yeah. Scores are affected by education and age. It doesn't always distinguish focal from diffuse problems well, and it's heavily weighted towards orientation and language, so it can miss right hemisphere or frontal lobe issues or subtle decline.
So MoCA is better for milder problems.
It was designed to be more sensitive, especially for mild cognitive impairment, by testing more domains, including more executive function and visual spatial tasks.
So use a screening tool, but maybe add more specific tests if needed.
That's often the best approach, and honestly, a skilled clinician gathers a huge amount of information just by carefully observing and talking with the patient during the history taking.
How so?
You're constantly assessing their memory for recent events, their orientation, language use, their mood, affect, insight, judgment, just by having a conversation. Even how the patient makes you feel can give clues about their mood or affect.
Right, so it's both formal testing and careful observation.
Exactly. The key takeaway, really, is that these higher cortical functions, as complex as they are, can be analyzed and localized, much like sensory or motor functions. And with ongoing advances in cognitive neuroscience and imaging, we're entering a really exciting era for understanding and diagnosing these conditions.
This has been incredibly illuminating. We've covered so much ground, from the brain's basic structure for thought, through the complexities of consciousness and self-awareness, to the different types and stages of memory and how we assess all this. It really drives home how intricate these processes are that, well, make us who we are.
It's truly foundational stuff.
So a final thought for you, the learner, to ponder. Given everything we've discussed about conscious versus unconscious processing, how might our approach to learning or even making decisions change as we understand these mechanisms better?
Or maybe, thinking about those complex memory networks, where do you see the most exciting potential for research? Enhancing memory, helping people recover from cognitive impairment. Lots to think about.
Definitely. Thank you for bringing these sources to us and joining us for this deep dive.